Hello Orchid friends, how are you? Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time watching my video, my channel is all about orchids. From what orchids I have, how I grow them, my thoughts on certain orchid topics, to what orchids in my collection are blooming, etc. So if you want to follow along my orchid hobby adventure, please consider subscribing to my channel and turn on the notification. Today in this video we're gonna look at this no ID Phalaenopsis orchid that I purchased from a grocery store. I think at the end of January 2018, so earlier this year. The flower you're seeing are the two flowers from the secondary spike, and we'll look into that, talk about it a little bit more. But for now, let's take a look at the video footage from earlier this year first. This is a mid-sized Phalaenopsis orchid. It's no ID because it's from a grocery store, and typically at a grocery store, their orchids, their butterfly orchid, Phalaenopsis orchids are typically no IDs. This is a mid-sized orchid, and at the time, I think it was having a total of 6 or 7 flowers. They all bloomed. There was no bud blast. As far as I can remember, there wasn't any bud blast, so it was good. But the reason I got this orchid was likely because of the spots. I think at the time I was very fascinated with orchids with random spots or polka dots kind of pattern. It was potted in a mixture of bark chips and sphagnum moss, and it had some pretty okay area roots coming out of the pot. It only had 4 leaves, and it was okay, but I think ideally for a mid-sized orchid, I like to see at least 6 leaves or more that I would consider it to be perfectly healthy. This orchid is pretty okay. It didn't have any fragrance, but the pattern and the lip, the color was enough for me for a winter season. At the time, it was just really cold, so having some flowers blooming indoors, it was just a very good feeling. At least have something that's more alive versus the winter. The only thing that I would like to complain about this orchid was that I remember the flower didn't last as long. Even the smaller flowers that open from buds in my care, in my environment, altogether, I think they all faded within 1 month. It may have to do with the season, but also the temperature, or it might have been because during winter time, I simply didn't fertilize enough. Now, it produced a secondary spike after the main flower spike finished blooming, and it was good enough for me. But even though it was only 2 buds, it was still pretty good for how much I pay. I think I only pay maybe $8 for this mid-sized orchid. For the primary spike that I cut, if it's green and I really have to cut it for whatever reason, I would always cut it under the first flower. And then wait until if the flower spike is completely spent and browned or die, that's when I cut it off completely. But when I say completely, I usually like to leave 2 to 3 inches, because if I handle the orchid, I prefer to handle it from the spikes, the dried up old spikes, versus grabbing onto the leaves or directly handling the root system. But one thing I notice about flowers coming from secondary spikes, they usually are smaller and they don't grow as robust, and sometimes the color isn't as saturated. And for example, this orchid, there weren't that many spots on these 2 flowers from the secondary spike. If you compare these 2 flowers to the original blooms on the main flower spikes, you would be able to tell the difference. And I know it may have something to do with fertilizers. In winter time, I tend to fertilize very little, and in springtime, I may gradually increase it, but I think at the time, I was just not very comfortable with fertilizing orchids that are in bloom. But I think I'll give that a try next time around, just to see it for myself, whether fertilizers do cause flower to drop early, because that has always been a myth to me. But I just haven't had the courage to want to do something about it, to find out for myself. So I think I'll try that next time with these peasant phals. I won't try it with my species phals, I think, just to be on the safe side. Because experimenting with cheaper orchids really is the way to go. I mean, I don't want to jeopardize the livelihood, the health of my species orchids. Okay, back to this orchid. Currently, you can tell I have already cleaned out the old media, which is a mixture of bark chip and sphagnum moss, since the main flower spike finished blooming. There isn't any water in the cup at the moment, because during that time when I took this video, I was giving this orchid a rest from the water culture. I mean, at first I would say this orchid was in full water culture, but the fact that I'm giving them a couple of days of dry period, it's really technically semi-water culture. And I told my Chinese subscriber, because they usually have a lot of questions about water culture method, and I told them, I said, it doesn't really matter whether it's full water culture or semi-water culture. It's just a way for us to handle or grow our orchid. And different orchid, different people, different environment, they may need different combination of wet, dry days. And they're just, or even 7 days in a week in full water, that's fine too. As long as the orchids are growing and healthy, it doesn't really matter. And they should always modify as they see whether the orchid is progressing or going down hills, right? They always should be adjusting depending on what they see. Now, what you see here is around mid-September, end of September. The roots are green. That's because I was soaking them. But right after the first day of, first day of fall, I see a very fast growing of roots all of a sudden. And you can see here that one water root just, shoot out 3 new root tips. And that was very encouraging. So overall, this orchid is doing pretty well in water culture. I can't say it's full water culture because it does have a day or two of dry period from time to time. Not every week, but just when I see that it's looking a little too waterlogged, I will make sure that I dump out the water. Now, this orchid is growing another new leaf. So from 4 leaf earlier this year to, 2 leaves. The first leaf that grew under my care, that one was very stubby, very small. I think that's just because it was converted to full water culture and it was trying to adjust. It was just a lot for this orchid to get accustomed to. So that leaf was smaller, but the latest leaf is much bigger now. So I think it's well on its way to a full bounce back, full recovery. Now, here's an example of why I like to leave my flower spike a little bit longer than usual. So that way, this one is in the cup in full water culture, so I don't really need to handle the roots all that much, because if I want to dump out the water, I simply just tilt the cup. But for my other regular orchids that's potted in other media, sometimes I do, pick them up from their flower spikes. That's just my personal preference, so that way I don't have to handle the orchid from their leaves, or I don't have to touch the roots if I don't need to, in case my hands are dirty or carrying some kind of pest from other plants or whatever. So that's just my personal preference, but I think this may be helpful for some of you who handle your orchids on a regular basis. So this is the update that I have for you for this No ID Phalaenopsis orchid. And I usually just call it the pink spotty. This is all I have for you today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to get more orchid related videos from my channel, please subscribe and turn on the notification. I want to wish you happy growing, and I will talk to you in my next video. Ciao!